Hello my friends! Today you'll see a huge release from me about late 50s Les Pauls, my experience of making precise copies of this legendary instrument and lots of nuances that affect the sound. And for sure you'll know what makes the difference between modern Gibson reissues and their vintage ancestors. This video is translated into English, so follow this link and you'll get what you want. So, let's go! First, allow me to share my personal background and how I got into the bursts. My cognition and studying journey began 10 years ago, when a good friend of mine told me that vintage Les Pauls have a shorter scale than modern reissues. He also mentioned that no modern Les Paul can compare to the vintage one. This got me going. I started collecting information and I began experimenting on my own guitars. I was rebuilding and refinishing my guitars while testing all possible vintage spec parts available on today's market. Personally, I tested all theories and all details and their practical application. There are tons of information and myths out there. It took me a while to sort it out. Finally, I stumbled across luthier Gil Yaron's topic on a forum. Gil was kind enough to put hundreds of pages documenting his journey of recreating original 59 Les Paul. I'm really grateful to Gil for kick-ass motivation and inspiration. Since I have read his pages several times, I've ended up studying English. At that point, I've made up a decision to build an uncompromised clone of 59 Les Paul. I've promised myself to crack the code and reconstruct this magical sound in the new guitar. I've almost forgotten to mention what I do for a living. I'm an artist. I specialize in historic art and recreation of old masterpieces. I deal with reverse engineering on a daily basis in my profession. I believe that it would be beneficial during my journey. That's why I've been continuing collecting information, searching forums and luthiers' articles. It took me another 18 months to create a working set of blueprints for the guitar. At that point, my personal woodworking experience has been pretty limited. Along with collecting and analyzing tech specs, I've started looking for the best luthier around, who would have agreed to work with wood for me. And I've succeeded. I came to his shop, we got acquainted and we became good friends. I've shared with him all my diagrams and researches, and we started our first projects. We're still continuing to cooperate, and I do finishing and relicking on some of his guitars built by my blueprints. Before the first prototype of Sophie Burst was built, we had made 7 guitars, where we honed necessary skills. My goal was to make an absolutely authentic build with appropriate dimensions, materials and junctions. It took me a year just to find the right wood. Finally, Sophie was built and I was stunned how well all individual parts work together to create that organic vibe. But is it really worth spending 3 years? Or I could have just bought a Gibson custom short guitar and relax? I've answered this question for myself at the very beginning of this journey. And that being said, Sophie Burst was an absolute proof of that, so let's figure out what differs modern Gibson reissues from original 59 bursts. In the early 50s, Gibson's vice president Ted McCarthy, who was also an engineer and designer, was cooperating with Lester Polfus, who was a magnificent musician and experimenter. This deal led to a solid-body guitar model that was named after Lester, Les Paul. In 1952, the first ever instance of Les Paul was sold in gold finish. At that point, Leo Fender had some success producing solid-body guitars, especially the improved Esquire model Broadcaster. Though Gibson and Fender have radically different approaches, Fender followed Henry Ford's business model with more productive and cheaper manufacture of innovative guitar constructors from ordinary wood and minimal leftovers. Gibson has decided to go a more traditional and complicated way of making guitars using more expensive wood, not focusing on the amount of waste. The idea was to create a premium and fancy instrument with authentic shape and historic legacy. Gibson used huge one-piece and non-glued mahogany bodies, maple tops that usually were used in violin manufacturing. Lester supposed that dark Brazilian rosewood would perfectly match guitarist fast fingers. Golden top and bindings were the icing on the cake. It was a masterpiece with a bit of shiny gypsy spirit. Obviously, 95% of the guitar players don't have an opportunity to play vintage Les Pauls. You can buy a house for the price of the burst. But even in lots of videos, you can hear that unique, sticky and bright sound with recognizable harmonics and voice. There are no modern guitar models at today's market that can touch it. The fact is that there are some exceptions when you cannot tell whether it's an original burst or replica. There are more and more fakes of Les Pauls on the market that are being advertised as originals. Joe Bonamassa, who owns 17 vintage, amazingly sounding bursts, states that he is not 100% sure that all of them are authentic. That's why I am embedding a hidden logo in my guitars. That would prevent any chance of the counterfeit. You might ask what component of the burst is responsible for the magic sound. Now, after all, I can confidently state that it's not a one specific individual part. Wood selection, angles, measurements, neck scale, glue, truss rod, pickups, wiring, plastics, parts, finish material, and so on and so forth. All these parts work together as a balanced and organic system based on a long-standing tradition of string instruments production. There are very specific principles behind the way vibration goes through the neck, body and back. This vibration cycle creates that infamous Les Paul sustain that we all love. First Les Paul prototypes were not made of the mahogany but of the cedar. Moreover, they had no serial numbers. Spanish mountain cedar is still considered to be the best material for string instruments. Unfortunately, this wood is pretty much extinct these days. Despite cedar prototypes, factory models were made of Honduran mahogany. It's very stable and medium-density wood. It is also less likely to have an issue within any parasites. There is some information that African mahogany was used for necks due to its higher density and resistance to string tension. Most of the wood those days was taken from wild forests. That resulted in using older trees for creating blanks. Older wood had low density that resulted in lightweight blanks. Nowadays, the majority of mahogany is grown for commercial purposes, and young trees are getting cut. That's why it's very hard to find lightweight and one-piece blank for the guitar bodies. The ability of the wood to vibrate is an essential part of forming the guitar sound. That's why a well-played old guitar body is highly valued. One of the ways to achieve this effect is a so-called conversion. It's a process of converting vintage Les Paul from the early 50s that needs restoration or even in mint condition into 57, 58 or 59 models. The changes being done are neck angle, original PAFs are getting routed for humbuckers, new flame maple top, new sunburst finish instead of gold top. Luthiers use original wood or old timber, vintage parts and original PAFs. Conversions like these have appropriate feel and sound. The price is 3-4 times lower than the original burst has, though you can buy a new car instead of it. I spent a lot of time researching the question why vintage wood and well-played guitars are so valued afterwards. I've come to the conclusion that, like any other materials, wood allows vibrations to go through it and resonate in a specific way. The best way to visualize is to look at the Chladni figures. You will see the differences between sound frequencies within your own eyes. The same thing happens to the guitar wood due to the string vibration. Since then, only specific frequencies are engaged to the formation of guitar sound. Moreover, wood itself memorizes these vibrations. The more you play guitar, the more wood responds to these frequencies and finally opens up. So what kind of technical process is behind this magic? Freshly cut down wood has a lot of unfermented tars, which keep it somewhat flexible. As time goes by, these tars are getting more fermented and crystallized. If guitars are played a lot, fermentation catches wood resonations, and as a result they shape to those particular frequencies. It's like snowflakes that are getting formed. This is obviously a very deep and controversial subject, but the fact is that the more guitar is being played, the better it sounds. Let's have a look at the whole construction system. For the tops, East American maple was traditionally used by Gibson because of beautiful wavy grain. This wood contains a lot of sugar and is used a lot for maple syrup production. As time goes by, sugar and tars are fermented and maple gets greater acoustical qualities. In my experience, the quality and characteristics of the wood from the North American continent differs a lot from the same European one. European wood is fragile, brittle and dry, while American one has a more viscous texture. The difference is quite obvious while whittling and seeing wood chips. Whittling European and Siberian wood produce fragile chips, while American one leaves long curled scabs. It relates to lots of wood species. It's just my observation. The actual vintage 59 Les Paul top carving is quite different in comparison to the modern one. But recently, custom shop anniversary models and 2019 collector choice reissues have been accurately transformed to vintage top carve. On the other side, most of the reissues have not such an authentic top. The main reason is in the depth of the fillet. Originally, Les Pauls were built based on the principles of the classic string instruments like violins or cellos. Earlier Gibson companies specialized in making mandolins. So the shape of the top was either decorative or a resonant part of the instrument. Vintage Les Paul fillet is deeper and more profound. I won't get into details about the resonance right now, I'll just tell you that it works like a spring. Indeed, vintage Les Paul neck scale was slightly shorter than modern one. Actual numbers are 24.56 inches or 623.82 mm scale, versus modern one with 24.75 inches or 628.65 mm. The difference is 4.8 mm. The reason for that is that in the 1950s, Rule 18 was used as a formula for frets layout. In those days, it was a traditional method due to the lack of computers or calculators. Later on, luthiers started to use more precise instruments, and the numbers appeared to be 17.817, which referred to a more accurate layout. But you know that any guitar is not an absolutely accurate instrument, so an average musician won't notice it. Musicians with perfect ears are playing the piano and say that any guitar never feels so accurate. As well as strings gauge and material affect the sound, so do 4.8 mm with the whole guitar system. We've got to mention here a truss rod, which also differs from the modern one. Today's guitar truss rod is placed in a radiused notch, so that it can arc the neck when you tighten the nut. It's really convenient. In addition, the truss rod is now covered with plastic inside the neck, so that it stays silent if it's installed incorrectly, within so-called dimensional tolerance. I believe it affects the sound negatively. Vintage Les Pauls had absolutely straight sawn notch in the neck. Up to 1959, thick necks had only compression-type truss rods. Only in 1960, Gibson began to make radius notches, adding arcing function to the truss rod. Neck profile became thinner, and the neck itself became more sensitive to the string tension. As a result, truss rod became able to provide an additional curve to the whole neck. So it's hard to underestimate the importance of the truss rod when forming overall guitar sound. Traditionally, Les Paul neck radius is 12 inches. This is true for vintage guitars as well as for modern reissues. Commonly accepted opinion is supposed to be like 59 till 58 baseball bat, 58 steel baseball bat, 59 perfect neck, 60 amazing, but 59 is better. I could hardly agree with this statement, and also need to notice that each neck profile of any vintage Les Paul was unique, sometimes even not symmetrical. Necks were handmade with the belt sander until they were ready. That's why either in 1958 or in 1960 there were both thick and thin necks, which slightly differed. 52 till 58 thick necks, 59 excellent, 60 thin slim taper. Here's, by the way, a chart of the original vintage necks. You can see now the difference. We finally reached a very critical construction detail, its neck joint to the body. We all got used to seeing a long tenon joint on modern reissues, but if we have a look inside, we'll notice the difference. This is how modern tenon looks like, and here's a vintage one. This step is crucial in transferring resonance from the neck to the body. Resonant waves are formed in the neck and then transferred to the body. Overall sustain, frequencies and the guitar response depend on the quality of these vibrational waves. Both vintage guitars and modern custom shop reissues have holey veneer on a headstock. Holey has smooth and steady structure, as well as high density and springiness, though modern standard models and other non-custom shop guitars have plastic headstock instead. You can only imagine how it affects the sound. Vintage Les Paul headstock thickness differs from the edge to the neck by 1 mm. This is the result of the machine sanding, and it also affects an overall tone a bit. Gibson logo has vintage design and is made of pearl. Standard Gibson logo looks slightly different. Les Paul print is made using silk screen above the varnish on both guitars. However, cheaper Gibson models have this print beneath the varnish and differs slightly just by outlines, font and color. Going back to the 50s, Americans were excited by the space, and lots of new materials appeared on the market. Gibson decided that nylon nut would be an innovative solution. This material is hard enough and strings slide quite well on it, but I do believe that traditional bone sounds better. Although nylon nut also contributes to vintage sound. Sometimes bridge saddles are made of this material. However, most modern guitars come from factory with plastic nut. Surely, vintage Les Paul fretboard was made of Brazilian rosewood. It's rare wood nowadays, since Brazil has already imposed an export ban of this wood and it is protected. There wasn't such a ban in the 50s as nowadays, and it was widely used even in production of expensive furniture. But this rosewood does look and sound great. This wood is greasier than an Indian one, with a light smell of chocolate and vanilla. These days Gibson produces limited reissue series with Brazilian rosewood, and these instruments are much more expensive. As far as I know, working with Brazilian rosewood is banned in the United States, so the necks are made in China, imported as an end product, and glued to the body in the United States. From the first glance, vintage and modern inlays look almost the same. Celluloid is generally used on both vintage and original instruments. However, vintage inlays are slightly bigger with more pronounced vertical lines. I can't say that it affects the sound, but is quite noticeable in overall vintage appearance. Formaldehyde furniture glue was traditionally used in the 50s to glue top with body as well as neck joint. It was cheap, convenient, but hazardous for the health. These days, white glue is used. Personally, I prefer quality hot Capacitors hide glue. Firstly, it's authentic. Luthiers used it for ages. Secondly, it's solid. And finally, it absorbs and gives moisture like wood does, providing the same tension. This is incredibly crucial for the proper resonance. Middle-range Gibson models like standard or traditional are usually equipped with zinc bridge and tailpiece. However, hardware for custom shop is made of lightweight aluminium, right like on vintage Les Paul. Such hardware is responsible for better resonance and specific frequency harmonics. Though modern models have short tailpiece bolts. Here are modern bolts and here are original 59 ones. The same thing goes to the bushings. This junction is substantial for delivering strained resonance to the wood. Everything matters here. Length of the bolts, bushings, as well as steel that is made of. It is considered that the brighter response to the tap test metal has, the better it sounds, like bell bronze or hard steel. But it's absolutely wrong. If metals have fixed molecular structure with tension that corresponds to a clang at a specific frequency, this frequency will mute corresponding overtone harmonics produced by the strings. The humbucker has the same effect. Noise from one coil kills noise from another one. That's why hardware from soft steel that doesn't clang but tap has better sound conductivity. Personally, I have tested this effect several times. Let's have a look at the pot knobs. Two different guitars have different locations of pots. And the question is, why so vivid detail was not considered in the reissues? If you remember, we've already mentioned scale differences. To be exact, it's 4.8 millimeters. That's how far the tailpiece was moved in relation to the tone block. Moreover, vintage Les Paul tailpiece was angled a bit, not as straight as it might seem. If you draw a line over studs, it will be precisely in the middle of two volume pots. By the way, this is one of the ways to check the authenticity. I hope at least it was. Traditionally, vintage instruments come with Clusen Deluxe tuners, as well as all modern reissues. These tuners have thin shafts and require 8.6 mm routings in the headstock where the little bushings are inserted. These tuners are lightweight and have a stamped housing. Some of the signature series come with Grover tuners. Grovers are heavier, requiring wider routing and slightly change the overall sound. It's up to you to decide which tuners to install. Tastes differ. I believe Grovers change response and sustain in a better way. I prefer them for convenience. That's why I installed them on my guitars. Grover. Now let's have a look at electronics. We all got used to seeing two-tone and two-volume knobs on a Les Paul. Obviously, volume knob controls volume and tone knob cuts high frequencies via capacitor. Both Vintage Burst and modern reissue have Bumblebee capacitors installed. But one has vintage paper oil caps and another one has film caps packed in a vintage cover. The difference in sound is terrific. Mind you, Gibson has begun to make almost precise copies of paper oil Bumblebee caps. As for me, I prefer either vintage Bumblebees or Soviet military caps K40U9 or green K42U2. What's next is the pot legs soldering. Modern soldering works just fine for playing a guitar. However, original vintage wiring with slightly adjusted schematics can do miracles. With volume and tone rolled off, the sound will become brighter and more transparent, as if opera vocals. This schematics is hard to deal with, but lots of modern musicians prefer it a lot. As you see, both guitars have vintage cloth insulated wires. This is the highest quality wiring for 59 style instruments. Can you imagine it without metal plates, thin wires or plastics? So, we've sorted out what forms the voice. Now let's sort out the mics that pick up this voice. Yes, I am talking about the mics now. Vintage PAFs are not potted with paraffin and have a microphone effect. In fact, PAF is two-in-one. It's a mic and a magnetic inductive sensor. That's why even material used for plastic frames around pickups is very important. Vibrations also go through these frames and are picked by the PAFs. These frames, as well as bobbins, are made of acetate butyrate. This material was widely used for bra latches due to its elastic qualities. Topic about PAFs as well as materials they are made of is considerable, and there are lots of pickups: burst buckers, custom buckers, boutique PAFs from small shops. In my experience, very few small boutique makers have come close to creating that authentic vintage voice of PAF pickups. Similar to the whole guitar construction, every little detail in the pickup plays a huge role in voicing. I have a detailed video about it here on my channel. If you haven't seen it before, here is the link. I highly recommend it. Topic about varnish is of high importance to me. It's a guitar's code and it defines both look and voice. Lots of people believe that nitro finish is all that a guitar needs for good voicing. Let's figure it out. Traditionally, Gibson used nitro cellulose varnish for guitar finishing. This varnish appeared in mass guitar building in the first half of the 20th century. Before that, shellac and expensive violin varnishes had been used. They needed more attention and were more tedious. Nitro varnishes were easier to work with and significantly cheaper. Nitro cellulose was used everywhere. It was used in household items, films, jewelry, and even explosives. However, nitro cellulose has some cons. Firstly, nitro varnishes are hazardous. Secondly, nitro cellulose is destroyed by the impact of light and oxygen. In order to prevent early checking, plastics and resins are added to the nitro varnish. These materials reduce shrinkage and improve elastic qualities. However, despite adding plastics, the structure of the nitro varnish might change within time. It becomes more fragile and eventually starts checking. Along with big checks, there are many micro ones, like pores, which fragment overall finish structure. Exactly this fault has eventually become a merit that helps to improve guitar resonance. While using UV light, we can see fragmented structure in vintage nitro varnishes. This mirroring effect is similar to the one we can see in the eyes, but it's tiny and almost invisible. In modern production routine, finish checking is considered as a defect. That's why modern factory nitro varnish includes lots of plastics, which you can feel. The varnish on the standard Gibson models is a bit stinky, and there are many people who believe that checked nitro varnish improves guitar tone like nothing can do. Let's have a look at it thoroughly. If a guitar is covered with a thick layer of hard polyester varnish, which is normally used in Asian factories, it changes the whole wood system, and it won't work for resonance and vibrations. On the other side, soft varnish is like a damper that kills lots of high frequencies, although it doesn't change vibrations. Using this effect, violin luthiers managed to mute specific sharp frequencies with soft, oil-based varnishes. But if we talk about solid body guitar, especially electric guitar, it's not needed. A layer of thin and hard nitro varnish creates tension on the top of the guitar without restricting resonance. But when this layer is being checked, it splits up into fragments. In this case, when the wood resonates, each varnish fragment acts independently and doesn't block any resonance wave. At the same time, this finish coat still protects the guitar body from environmental impacts. Nitro varnish became so popular in the guitar world because of its ability to check and to affect the sound. That's why the word nitro is used in a bundle with checks, microfragmentation and tension as a result of shrinkage. If you are not a fan of checking, then you'd better look for another type of varnish. Don't even think about nitro, just choose the thinnest layer available. It is believed that the lighter the guitar is, the better it sounds. Moreover, you'd like to know that this belief has replaced an opposite one about heavy guitars. Unfortunately, it has appeared thanks to the vintage bursts. As I've already mentioned, in the 50s, Les Pauls were made of old wood blanks with more open and even grain. What's more, old-grown mahogany like that is lighter than modern one. Although I need to mention the time that this wood has been played, tars that have been fermented, and the frequency memory of the instrument. According to my research, original burst weighed somewhere from 8.10 to 9.72 pounds. It's like 3.67 to 4.41 kilos. To my experience, light guitars are likely to be greater to sound. However, there are some heavy instruments that sound amazing. For sure, light guitars respond to resonance quicker and sound great even unplugged, but they are often lost in the mix. The weight of my Les Paul, that you've already seen in my videos, is 9.37 pounds. This weight is close to original vintage instruments, and I like it a lot. It sounds above the mix on any sound level. But there's one aspect that helps the whole system work in harmony. It kills resonance feedback and sustain of the guitar, no matter what wood it was made of as well. It's a tonal match of the body and neck. I suppose I'll make an original video about it to give you more details about this theory that I've confirmed several times in my experience. If you'd like to see the results of my experiments, you should watch the video where we made a guitar according to this theory. Results are astonishing. Brand new guitar sounded like a well-played vintage instrument. Everything mentioned above is just a part of one big organic system. Lots of small details and differences like a truss rod bell cover, truss rod nut, neck joint position, tone block specifics, bridge. I've skipped lots of details because this video has already become too long. Later I'll tell you about each detail thoroughly, so don't forget to subscribe to my channel. Well, let's sum up the peculiarities of the original burst that affect resonance and form its unique voicing. So, old, lightweight and well-played wood, vintage scale, Brazilian rosewood, proper top carving, proper long neck tenon, glue, space between tailpiece and tone block, material and size of the studs and bushings, Hardware material. Material of plastic pickup frame. High density nitro varnish with crackular and fermented age structure. Vintage wiring. Unpotted PAFs. So, and musicians' hands. Even musicians' hands are the most powerful instrument to retrieve the voicing and potential of the guitar, and the guitarist is the only one who can make the guitar sound, so don't forget about the music when trying to reach that miracle voice. The guitar is just an instrument in the musician's hands and we play it for the music. I hope you found lots of useful information and I haven't overloaded your attention. Anyway, I'm not saying goodbye for a long time, play the music and get high from this process.
Rock and roll for all.